Hi, welcome to this Microsoft Flight Simulator tutorial where I will be showing the simplest way of flying the Airbus A320. With this video, I aim to enable the viewers to fly right after these following 17 minutes. This required some narrowing down of all the possible ways of carrying out each procedure. With this aircraft, like other commercial jets, you have multiple options regarding the approach type, horizontal and vertical navigation, speed configuration, etc. To keep things simpler, we will cover a single way of each procedure and use high level of automation. And there will be no workload that is not directly flight related, such as ATC communication, manual flight changes, or from scratch setup. With all these said, you will be able to fly from and to your favorite airport safely with A320 after this tutorial. I also summarized the content of this video into this one-pager, and you can find the link to it in the description below. This will be a good reference for you to remember all the necessary steps in case you forget in your future flights. Always comes in handy to have something like this. One last thing before the video. I'm flying on an Xbox Series X with no mods installed and no equipment, so my setup is as basic as possible, which I think is no problem with this sim, especially if you're flying just for fun like myself. Today we are departing from Warsaw Airport runway 33 to Prague Airport runway 30. And we select High Altitude Airways. Your waypoints should look like this. These will be programmed into MCDU, the aircraft computer, automatically. Your departure and arrival pattern should look like this. We select ILS 30 approach, which will also be automatically programmed into MCDU. As you see, we will have a long final and a lot of time to be fully configured, which is ideal for this tutorial. Alright, click on the performance page on the MCDU and let's fill in the takeoff part. I will talk about MCDU in more detail later on. We're going to enter 1 for flaps so the aircraft can compute an appropriate speed for this phase. 55 for flex to temperature so we can take off without full power, and 6000 for transition altitude, which is when we will switch to standard air pressure. So our VR speed, which is our rotation speed, is displayed as 146 knots. This is the speed we will pull back on the side stick and lift our nose. And the thrust reduction altitude of 1850 will mark the end of takeoff, and the aircraft will tell us to put the throttle to climb, and climb phase will start. We'll make sure that the speed brake is retracted, flaps are at 1, and we'll put in our cruise altitude, which is 38,000 today. Now we can release the parking brake and apply flex thrust. We are configured for departure. Just keep the aircraft on the center line as much as you can. We will rotate slowly when the speed is at VR speed, and then follow the guidance of the flight director, which is the 2 lines on the primary flight display that show us where the airplane should be headed, both vertically and horizontally. It will ask us to pitch up progressively. We have positive climb rate, so gear up. The letter S you see on the speed indicator is the speed you can retract your flaps, so we do that. This is also known as the clean speed. Continue chasing the lines of the flight director. Now we keep this pitch until the climb phase starts, which is the thrust reduction altitude that we saw on the MCDU. There it is. CLB letters are showing in the PFD, which means that we will now turn on the autopilot and retract the thrust to climb descent. We passed our transition altitude of 6,000 feet, so we are switching the barometric pressure from local to standard, which is essential for air traffic control. Our departure pattern is straight today. If that was not the case, the flight director could tell you to bank to one side right after takeoff. If that is the case, let's say in another flight, just follow the vertical guidance during your takeoff and the autopilot will put you in course later on. So basically, do not turn during your takeoff. The MCDU now shows that we are in the climb phase, where it targets a speed of 320 knots. If you click on next phase, you will see that the cruise, descent and approach phases are ahead of us. We will visit this approach page again later in the flight. We are climbing through flight level 26 at a vertical speed of 2000 feet per minute without any problems. If you zoom out a little bit, you will see a little arrow here. This is the point where the aircraft will level off. We are leveling off at this point as indicated previously, and the cruise phase starts. The other little arrow that you see is our top of descent. The aircraft suggests that it would be efficient to start your descent at that point. You could also calculate it manually with something called 3 to 1 rule, which gives you a good approximation on when to descend, but we won't be needing that today. Last thing we'll do before we can take a break and enjoy the cruise is to check what altitude we will descend to. Now obviously in reality descent can be a multi-step process with the ATC and the traffic, but today we're flying without ATC and we will clear ourselves directly to the altitude that is appropriate for our approach. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the approach chart for this video, but what we need to know here is that if we keep flying at 4,000 feet on our final approach, we will be able to capture the localizer and the glide slope at this start point. Now, there isn't really much to do at cruise after this point except for enjoying these beautiful camera angles. Meanwhile, let's go over the way we are flying this aircraft today. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I wanted this tutorial to be simple, so we have chosen the most basic and easily understood method for each procedure. For horizontal navigation, we are using nav mode. The autopilot is following the waypoints that are programmed into MCDU one by one automatically. An alternative would be using heading mode, where you select a certain heading. You can even fly the entire route manually if you follow the flight director, but obviously it would bring about some extreme workload. For vertical navigation, we are using managed mode. In this mode, you tell the aircraft what altitude you want to be at, and it decides on pitch angle, thrust, and speed, and comes with a vertical speed rate that is adjusted by the aircraft as deemed necessary. Speaking of speed, the aircraft determines the speed in each phase by itself and shows it on the performance page of the MCDU. It will take into consideration the flight phase and an altitude that you're at. Changing this calculated speed rate on the MCDU is possible. Also, you can engage the selected speed mode on the far left knob in the autopilot panel. That way you can force the plane to fly at a certain speed. It will change the thrust accordingly. Approach types are a whole different story. There are multiple methods available, but an ILS approach is the most frequently used one, and certainly the easiest and most precise one. Another pastime I enjoy during cruise is to play with weather and the time of day from the menu. You can select from different cloud types, or you can fly through a storm. You can experience nighttime flying, or a beautiful sunrise or sunset. Alright, back to work. The little arrow on the navigation display marks the end of cruise for us, and we are starting our descent. Put in 4,000 feet for altitude and press the knob for a managed descent. The aircraft will put its nose down immediately. Again, you can see our level off point in the display thanks to this arrow. It is close to the second arc, so we know that it will take about 40 miles for us to level off. Here is how our descent looks like from the perspective of passengers. So the aircraft is descending with idle thrust, which is the efficient way of doing it. Both the thrust and pitch angle are determined by the FMGC, the Flight Management Guidance Computer, to produce this vertical speed rate. Remember, we are able to interact with the FMGC through the MCDU. If you are not happy with this vertical speed, you can always select it here and command the vertical speed yourself. Now we are at flight level 14, and this arrow is displaying some inconsistencies. You can suspect that there is an altitude constraint in the next waypoint, probably for safety or noise reasons. Make sure you have constraints being shown in the display with this button. There is a constraint, but I know for a fact that it is not 1190, so there is something going on here, but no worries. It will not affect our planned approach. I'm adding this clip from another flight with the exact same flight plan. This time it works the way it should. As you can see, we have an altitude constraint of 11,700 feet. The aircraft delays its descent in this case. As you can see here, although flight level 40 is commanded, it has engaged Alt Star mode, which means it is about to level off. Actually, we have constraints after this waypoint as well. The aircraft will just continue its descent based on these constraints, and when there is none, it will go down to 4,000 feet. This will have no effect in our final approach. Now back to our original flight, where the aircraft decided to go to 4,000 feet directly after all. Remember we had to switch to standard pressure after our transition altitude? Now we have passed through our transition altitude again, this time when descending, so we switch back. You can also switch units with the outer knob here depending on which country you're flying in. The autopilot is making the last turn of this flight where we have a long straight line to the airport in our flight plan. We still have a constraint in the next waypoint, 5,000 feet. Because of the glitch earlier, now we are below it. Normally, the aircraft would have descended from the previous constraint to 5,000 feet and then to 4,000 feet. Now the decel point marks the start of our approach. As we get close to it, the approach phase will be automatically activated. I did not push that activate the approach phase button on the MCDU, but keep in mind that if it is not automatically activated, you do need to press it manually. The aircraft decreased its targeted speed because it knows we are preparing to land now. Notice the equal sign on the speed indicator. This means we can extend flaps 1. As we extended the flaps, the aircraft is now able to target an even lower speed. Here is another equal sign, so we can extend flaps 2, but let's wait for that and fill in the approach phase on the MCDU. We will put in local pressure, temperature, and wind direction and speed. You can get this information from ATC or weather menu. Or if you are flying real time, you can look up online as well. And let's put 200 feet for decision height for our ILS approach. If we are not seeing the runway at this height, we will abort the landing, but today we have perfect weather, so that won't be the case. Alright, now we can extend flaps 2. Keep extending the flaps as you see equal signs until flaps full. The targeted speed will decrease progressively as you do so, and it will end up somewhere around 140 knots, which will be the landing speed. Next, we arm the auto brakes and speed brakes so they will automatically deploy upon touchdown. Medium auto brakes will be enough today. Click on the LS button below the pressure display and it will start to show localizer and glide slope indicators on the primary flight display. In an ILS approach, we have precise guidance from ground equipment both vertically and horizontally. It is not active yet, so aircraft still flies at the commanded altitude and follows this line on the navigation display. We are a bit early at this altitude and we are low. As we will continue, the glide slope indicator will come closer to the middle. There it is. Let's arm these by pressing the approach button. The localizer is quickly captured as we were already horizontally aligned with the runway, and it's a matter of seconds before the glide slope is captured. There it is. Now the aircraft is flying through the ideal angle by itself. The altitude you put in the autopilot is no longer followed. We are also visual with the runway. At this point, I'm not touching anything. The aircraft is precisely navigated from the ground on both horizontal and vertical axes. We are getting closer to 2,000 feet, which is a good reference point for extending the landing gear. We are at 1,000 feet. You can disconnect the autopilot anytime you want. The aircraft will continue to fly like this, but you may need to apply some small corrections. There we go, I disconnected the autopilot and I'm manually flying now. It's more visual now than instrument, actually. At 30 feet call out, you will flare, meaning you will need to lift the nose up, After that, you will put the thrust to idle. If you don't, it will be harder to establish yourself onto the ground, and even when you do, you will retain your speed and risk not being able to stop in time. I applied really small corrections. Lifting the nose up, small easy flare here, thrust idle, and we are down. The aircraft applies the brakes and the speed brake automatically since we armed them. Just focus on remaining on the center line. You can start applying maximum manual braking anytime if you want to stop earlier. There you go. It is now time to try all this with your own simulator. Hit the subscribe button and leave a like if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next video.